getting into some of the elements of design, as mentioned earlier, the vertical face of the salt marsh is an intense location of attack. And to counteract that, we have to design around what we believe or what we understand to be the forcing mechanisms. So we've mentioned before ice, we've mentioned the tide, we've mentioned foot traffic. We've prevented the foot traffic by putting the fence around the site. Ice, there's not much we can do. We put pressure transducers out into the bay, and we measured for long periods of times not only the tide so that we could get the elevations correct for mean high water, mean tide, etc. But we were also putting pressure transducers out there in order to understand the wave climate. One excellent design guide we had was the fact that at the end of this sill is a pier that's been there for over a century, a rock pier that the gondolas would use to load and offload product. And so we knew the size of the rock that was there was very stable. And so basically the design exercise was using various design methods to size this rock or whatever we needed to protect this leading edge, and then ultimately compare to what was there. Behind it is not a geotextile. I don't really like putting plastic into the environment. So what we typically use are core products, coconut fiber products with very small openings that would hold back the fine materials of the sediment that we place behind it. And then that core product ultimately breaks down in time, and ultimately what would be created behind this is a graded filter. In the future, what we typically see right after you build the site is when you're going to have about the sparsest vegetation, especially if you're planting sets. You have this bare surface that water is running across every time the tide comes in and out. And even that's a relatively slow movement of water. It generates velocities high enough that can gully. So I think in the future what we would do is bring the core material from behind the rock up to at least the leading maybe 10 feet or more of the marsh to avoid that type of erosion on the surface. And again, as you'll see in the close-up, the vegetation just grows right up through it. And so green infrastructure compared to gray infrastructure, gray infrastructure is the best. It's perfect the day you build it. Whereas green infrastructure, it's the weakest once you've built it, and over time it stabilizes because you're expecting vegetation to take over for you. One of the aspects of the Wagon Hill project that we've adopted from stream restoration practices is including what are called root wads. In this case, you have basically the bottom 15 feet to 20 feet of a tree without the limbs put into the backfill material, and then we built the sill around them. Before we backfilled over these, we used cable ties with duckbill anchors and stainless steel cable to hold them down because the wood ultimately would float, so we want to hold it down. And then the sediment over the top of it also holds it down. But one of the issues with the root wad is that, one, it's a natural material, it's wood, but it's got a lot of topography, microtopography. And typically, as we use in stream restoration, the more variability you have of the hydraulic environment, velocity, water depth, turbulence, typically the more diversity you get in the aquatic species that are going to be there, and that would be both flora and fauna.
The planting design for this system is based on what you see here. This is really what was here initially, so we want to mimic what the plants and the site have sort of produced on their own. And we're obviously making this better and harder, and we're going to change things. But we wanted to mimic the different types of plants and how the plants changed as we went from lowest elevation to highest elevation. You can see here we have long-lived brown algae that's healthy in the system, and it's growing on scattered rocks. So we've placed it on some of these rocks to have us, the first line of defense is when waves come, and algae's floating, they can hit the algae and start breaking up some of that wave force, and hopefully we'll get more algae in the future. Here we can see peat. This is the exposed peat from the original peat at the site, the remnant marsh. And this remnant marsh is planted with Spartina alterniflora, the low marsh plant. That's typically the only plant that really survives, and it's because it's a perennial grass, it comes back year after year. So these plants, these taller plants were planted by hand. You can see some of the lower plants just behind them were already existing. So just 15 feet in from the shoreline, those plants just came back, but they're growing in peat. And so all these plants aren't growing quite as tall as they might expect. Right about here we have a line between low marsh and high marsh. And so this is the point at which other species can start surviving well. At this point we put a core log, and so this is a core log here which protects the side of this existing transition to high marsh and upland. And we brought it around and put it between the low marsh and high marsh just as a demarcation. It was really valuable and useful because you can walk on this core log without damaging the marsh. So it was kind of a handy thing to have in our system. Above here we have Spartina patens and a variety of other plant species, Juncus gerardii, disticulus, and then a little higher up we have the upper edge of the marsh, which is Spartina pectinata, or slough grass. Again, this was here, and so we planted some pectinata a little farther down as well. Above the pectinata, we have a variety of different shrubs. We have some goldenrods, some primrose, and some plants that were planted as ornamentals. This site, the client wanted turf. They wanted the marsh to look like a full-fledged marsh the very first year, or at worst the second year we put it in. And so a turf was developed and planted by Pearson Nurseries, where 8 Spartina plants, alterniflora low marsh plants, were planted and overwintered, and 8 Spartina patens plants were planted and overwintered in one flat. And then those flats were brought, and the whole flat was placed on the surface of the marsh. Because of some weather issues in the spring and surprise flooding for our grower, most of this Spartina alterniflora did not survive. We ended up doing a lot of hand planting. So we worked with a supplier, and he supplied us with new plants. We also purchased some new plants a little early in the season to make sure that they were in. We really like to plant plants in May, and that's what the first set was done, but we finally finished the planting in July, which was really late. And it's hard for the plants to be in that heat and to be able to put those new roots down and survive. But they seem to have worked really well. You might notice the rocks here and there. That's to break up any potential ice impacts. And it's also a landing spot for birds of prey or other birds that might want to have a little spot. The Spartina patens, which is all white, it looks all dead. It's not all dead, but there's a lot of dead. So we see live plants growing in here. It took off so well the first season that it may have dried out the soil too much in the winter, and actually had a drought issue during the winter when the ground was frozen. I'm not sure why it died. That's my best guess. We also planted by hand sprigs of disticulus and juncus, and so I wanted to show everyone the disticulus is right in front of me here. One step. This is disticulus spicata. You can see how much it's spread. That's one growing season. It's amazing. We also planted Juncus gerardii, and so here's 2 plants of Juncus gerardii. These original plants were already here, so again we're just mimicking what was here. We see the Spartina pectinata, the rough cordgrass. So we're going to go onto our marsh. So a little farther along the marsh, we see Panicum virgatum and rough cordgrass at this upper edge. And then we move into different shrubberies. We have sweet pepperbush, we have bayberry, highbush blueberry, some dogwood, and some viburnum, and a couple other species up here.